This week on Bible Fiber, we have a special guest, Tim Mahoney. We are taking a little break from our Ezekiel study, and Tim is a Christian filmmaker and documentarian. I first learned of his work because two of my professors at the Bible Seminary have participated in his films. I also had the chance to see his film called The Moses Controversy a few years ago when it first came out. Tim now has a new film as part of his Patterns of Evidence series. It's called The Israel Dilemma: Ancient Prophecies, and it's screening on November 13th, 14th, and 17th in theaters nationwide. So we are about 2 weeks away from showtime, and I'll put a link in the show notes for how you can purchase your ticket in advance. Tim always puts a ton of research into his documentaries, and in this film, he builds the case that ancient Israel has been in the promised land since the time of Abraham. And there's a strong focus on the biblical story and the archaeology of Israel, like a lot of the Patterns of Evidence films. So first off, Tim, welcome to the show, and it is wonderful to meet you.
Well, Shelley, it's great to meet you too, and I'm impressed with all the stuff that you've been doing. Not many times do I talk to someone who has a podcast that also is involved with archaeology. So great to
Well,
be
I
here.
guess we dance in the same circles, that's for sure. Can you tell me what inspired you to make this film? In my head, there's a pre-October 7th mentality and a post-October 7th mentality. And with your film coming out almost at the anniversary of that, were those horrific events any part of your motivation for making the film, or were you already working on it?
Well, I had when I returned from finishing the first film in 2015, I was thinking and praying about what to do, and I felt like God said, "Cast a vision." So Steve Law, who has worked with me for a long time, my researcher and co-writer, he and I worked on outlining. We had like 50 films that we outlined, working our way through the Bible, and so that's what ended up happening. Was we're on number 7 and 8 now with this film, but in 2007, when I was making the Exodus, we tell the story about how we went to Israel, and when I got there, I said, I want to talk to the leaders of your nation and ask them about the Exodus, and that allowed me to get an interview, an unusual interview with Benjamin Netanyahu. He was in between being prime minister, so he was still at the Knesset, and I went to the Knesset and interviewed him. And then I went to interview Shimon Peres, who was, I think, the president at the time of Israel. So unusual that this guy from Minnesota would get these interviews, and a number of very important interviews then have been captured, and they've been sitting in the video bank, as it were, because they weren't quite right for them to come out. And then when that attack happened last year, I just knew, wow, this is important. And then when Harvard and all these other colleges were having these riots and protests and things like that, I just thought we really need to go back to the Bible and ask the question, well, where did this all begin? And in our film, it begins in the book of Genesis, and we tell about creation. And this film is going to be in theaters, like we said, the 13th, 14th, and 17th. And you can buy tickets for it. If you go to patternsofevidence.com, you can buy tickets. But the point of this film is to really, I think, help people to understand who are these people. Why is it that they seem to be surrounded and wanting, people to destroy them? And I'm trying to unfold that story from a biblical context. So that's a little bit of how we got to this. But you're right. If that attack hadn't happened, I probably would have been on a different film. But I felt that we needed to move to be more current with what's happening, so we could all understand a little bit what's going on.
I noticed Shimon Peres as one of your interview guests, and I actually have 20 years ago, I worked for the Israeli Consul General in Boston, and Shimon Peres was in town visiting, and he was doing some speaking engagements, and it was my job. I was 22 years old, and this was my first job out of graduate school, to make sure that he would always have the opportunity to eat out of the public eye. And that's what I learned, that someone also does that for the Pope. Like, you never see the Pope eat in public, because if you're about to go out and shake hands and kiss babies, you also need to be nourished, and
Yeah.
already at that point too, he was an elderly gentleman. But that's wonderful. And Netanyahu's in the film, and so that was really impressive to have that all-star cast of guest interviewees. Can you give me, so I saw the documentary last week, which is really beautiful done. What is your elevator pitch in terms of what is the main thesis of the Israel dilemma? Can you tell that to our listeners?
Right. Does Israel, according to the Bible, have a covenant with God? And is that covenant everlasting? And so the covenant is actually a legal agreement. And as I'm becoming more conscious of, I would probably say that for all of us, we exist. But there's a period of time when you become self-aware that you exist, and you just realize, well, where did I come from? And I remember when I was like 5 years old, waking up a Saturday morning, and I see a foot in the bed, and I go, whose foot is that? And then I go, oh, that's my foot. And then it was like, well, where did I come from? And this idea of existence, and God has called everything into being from nothing, and he's called us to this existence. And the nation of Israel was called into existence because of this relationship, this covenant that God had with Abraham. And so at some time I'm going to tell the story about the Tower of Babel, God willing, and the ark, and we're moving towards that. But the reason this is important, because this one nation God separated to himself. There's all these other nations, and he separated this group of people. And through those people, he spoke through the prophets, and Moses records the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. And that's how we have this information of our origin, of our coming into existence, truths, Shelley. And I think that they've been invited then, they're in this covenant. And so what happened was, I believe there's a supernatural, I'm investigating the question, is there a supernatural agreement that if you are a Jewish person, that you would belong to God's, chosen people? And the reason why I am examining this is because for some reason there's an unnatural attack on these people throughout the centuries. And they have lived a very, very difficult life being Jewish. And I think that a lot of people, including Jewish people themselves, don't understand what this is. And many people today don't know the Bible. They don't know the whole story. So this is going back to saying, okay, let's go back, and I'm going to try in my own way to tell you the story. And you in my introduction, you said I'm a Christian who's a filmmaker. In some ways, I look at it like this: I'm an investigative filmmaker who is a Christian, and I'm because there's a difference in the sense of my films have been question films, asking questions, and they're and I don't mind if people. I think what I've had to come to is I've had to come to the decision that it's true because it is true, not because somebody said it was true. Just like some other people are saying things are true but that aren't true at all, But they're trying to say, well, because I said it's true, it's true. And so in this particular case, these patterns of evidence films, the idea of searching for a pattern, and the wonderful thing is that we have this scripture, we have this word that is really amazing, that this testimony that we have, and it is a testimony of God acting in history. So what is the short answer for what is this film about? It's, does God have a covenant with the Jewish people? And then the question is, well, how would you look for that? And that's where I came up with, once again, a pattern. We've got 5 different parts to this pattern. Moses writes that the Jewish people will become a kingdom. And he says, but there's going to be blessings if you obey God, and there's going to be curses if you don't obey God. And so what's happening here is, he says, eventually you're not going to obey God. You're going to worship idols. And if you do that, the curses are coming on you. And here's what they are. You're going to be your kingdom is going to be destroyed. You're going to be scattered among the nations. You're going to be persecuted. But then in the future, there's a promise: you will return to the land. And I look for that in this investigation, and that is the premise of the whole film. Can we find a pattern for that?
And you have Dr. Israel Finkelstein in the film too. You talk about showing the other side as a investigative reporter. So did you experience any pushback to having him in the film, or where do you feel like his points landed in the grand narrative?
Well, I'm a likable guy, I think. And when I went to see him, he was trying to vet me, so he took me off when I first got there. My Israeli producer was really nervous about it, and he took me off. He goes, "Come, let's go talk to my offices. They're setting up the cameras." And I think he was smart enough to know I'm not going to sit in front of a camera with somebody who I don't vet first. So we sat down and talked, and he said, "So tell me about yourself," and then I said. Somehow in this conversation, I said, "Well, I want to see Manfred Bitek." And he said, "You talked to Bitek?" I said, "Yes, I went to talk to him at Avaris." "Really? What did he say?" And so once I dropped Manfred Bitek, which I didn't have any clue that would be of great interest, because I don't know if Israel Finkelstein ever talked to Manfred Bitek, but he respected him, I think. And I think the issue here is chronology in my mind. I mean, that's what I came to understand as I've investigated this, is when did things happen, and can you find evidence for it? And the genius of a patterns of evidence film, which I think was inspired by the Lord, is to search for patterns, because everybody can just take an objective step back and go, okay, you said this. Why should I believe this? Well, if I'm going to give up my faith, why should I believe what you're saying, that there's no evidence for this? Can you explain to me how you reached that conclusion? And once you start to make it that simple, it becomes very interesting, because you start to realize that sometimes these scholars have faith in something too. They have faith in what their ideas are. There are other scholars who I'm disappointed in, because there's other evidence, but because they've been dipped and the varnish has dried, they are not going to change their position. They're going to stay true to what they were taught or what they were discipled in. And so I just think that the films that I've been making have just been trying to ask that honest question. And Israel Finkelstein, then, after I passed the test there, we went and back, and I asked him just a whole series of questions. And I think it was a great interview. And afterwards, he said to me, "Would you like to come and dig with me?" And he invited me to come, and I probably should have, but my daughter was getting married, my oldest daughter, and I just thought, at that time, I'm not going to sacrifice that. I've got to be at a wedding. But I think that he knew that I was sincere, and I think that's the reality in all these interviews, is I'm just asking for what is the truth. How do we know? Can you explain this to me? I'm the doubting Thomas for them. I don't quite know if I believe what you're telling me, because to say that this didn't happen, there's quite a risk. So when I talk to Zeev Herzog, or I talk to William Deaver, Donald Redford. Donald Redford and William Deaver grew up in Christian homes. And I think there's reasons why people don't believe, but they aren't always the ones that you might think. I think what ends up happening is that faith is a combination of faith in believing, and also there's a sense of the presence of God and the presence of the Holy Spirit. So there's a lot of prodigals out there, and some of these scholars are prodigals, by the way. They're in rebellion, and you read throughout history about men who were atheists who, on their dying bed, cry out to God, because at the end of the day, there's a God-shaped hole in our hearts, and so anyway, I think there's a lot to be said, and as far as what this is about, but I think the whole premise of the Israel dilemma, I believe, is that it has to be, that film had to be said now. I mean, that information should be given now. And I've shared this on a couple of these different interviews that as I prayed about making this kind of film, and I said, what am I making? What is this about? You know, I'm working hard for years on these films and going and doing these interviews, and you're wondering how it's going, if you're going to be able to afford to even pay the bills, and you're dealing with all that. And after weeks, how God works in my own life is after weeks, there's a sense I hear this voice or this sense of what it is. And I felt like God said, remembrance and forewarning. So the films I'm making, I believe many of them are films of remembrance and forewarning of things that are coming. And some people, that would bother them. So, well, that's too bad. That's what I'm doing, I think. Definitely a remembrance. And then what do you need to be forewarned about?
So on the Bible Fiber podcast, we have done the 12 minor prophets, we've done Ezra and Nehemiah, and now we're in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is the prophet living in exile, or the priest and prophet living in exile. And you do have part of the film that really talks about compelling prophecies about Israel's return to the land after the exile. Is there anything during your research or story writing that caught your attention of how the prophets leading up to the exile, before the exile, pointed to Israel's return to the land?
I think that Jeremiah was the one that I was fascinated by because of how the courage that Jeremiah had to have. Because Jeremiah knew that what he was going to say was not going to be good news. But he was trying to tell them, go. You know, this is part of what God is doing. And I didn't get into this, but I think about the fact that when you you're supposed to have your land rested for so many years, and they didn't. Every seventh year or something, they were supposed to rest the land. And when you think about what happened was that the Israelites violated right from the beginning. They weren't obeying these commands. And I think that's, if I was to say anything, if you look at Jeremiah was trying to say is, listen, we have a legal agreement here with God, and he says these things you're supposed to do, and they weren't doing it. And the challenge, I think, is that there were probably a lot of religious leaders that were, that weren't doing their job. And, then God has to call on these people like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, and he puts a fire in them, to basically speak the truth when it's not popular. And and I think about Jeremiah, having to do what he had to do, and how God spoke through him. And I think that's the challenge. I mean, with the truth, it's uncomfortable for people to say, well, God is saying this, and we're doing this over here. Hey, anyone paying attention here? And so the film, The Israel Dilemma, kind of an interesting name. Well, it's kind of like on the surface, Israel has a dilemma because they're surrounded and multiple groups want them to be annihilated. But if you look at the scriptures more clearly, and as we're going to look at them in this first film, it doesn't have it quite as much as the second film will be Return to the Promised Land. We're going to really look at what happened to the nations that were difficult with Israel, that were basically punishing, hurting them or whatever. God dealt with those nations, and he said, okay, I'm going to use you for a while, but then you're going to be in trouble. And I'm going to look at that from an archaeological, historical perspective. And but the dilemma isn't just for the nation of Israel. The dilemma, I believe, I'm raising the question, is for the world. The world is in a dilemma. And the only real ally I think Israel has at the moment is the United States. I mean, it probably has some other, relationships that they're doing, but the real strong, 900-pound gorilla in the room is United States. That could change, and then Israel could be standing alone.
I am in this exact headspace right now. We are just finishing, or just about to launch. I'm finished writing, but we're about to launch into Ezekiel's oracles against the nations. And it's a 8 chapters of Ezekiel focusing on the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Egyptians, the Tyrians, and he has a harsh word for all of them. And this is the portion of Ezekiel that's considered the comforting words for Israel. So I've been thinking a lot about why it's classified as words of comfort for Israel, if it's all harsh words directed at Israel's neighbors. But Ezekiel was talking to Jews that are living in trauma. They're in exile. They're kicked out of their nation. They're about to find out that their temple's gone, that their city's gone, and there's really no hope of return unless they believe, like you said, Jeremiah the prophet, who says they'll return in 70 years. But it is amazing because at the same time as studying that, also just seeing Israel with a 7-front war right now with all of its neighbors and dealing with Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran. And so it really does feel like these are words of comfort. So I don't even know if before October 7th, I would have read Ezekiel's oracles against the nations in the same way. It might feel like a little bit of old news because the Ammonites and Moabites have already been destroyed. There are no more Edomites. But instead, I feel that because Israel's now again living in trauma, that they're living this reality again, that if they are to have a future, if there is to be redemption, God has to do something about these terrible neighbors. And so actually, so at the end of this film, you kind of tee up that there's going to be another Patterns of Evidence film, and it might focus on Israel's modern story. So can you give us an idea of what you're working on for the future?
Yeah, we're that film's right in process right now. I think in about 2 weeks we're going to have that, and that's even. I mean, this film is, I feel, really turned out well. We've got these recreations with Hezekiah and Isaiah and Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar and the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. We were able to tell that, and I don't think anyone's ever been able to communicate that. I don't think ever before has this narrative been put together. So, it helps, I think, for people to have just a basic understanding of the overview of the Bible. That's why this is so important. And if you've got children or teenagers or college students that are wondering about their faith or just don't know, one of the things that can happen is that they go off to school and they take. In fact, I gave a talk last week, and it was actually I was to a Catholic men's group, and the priest said that when they went off to college, at that time the Bible class that he took was an anti-Bible class, and it completely almost destroyed his faith. He could hardly read any of the scriptures because what he had been told. And so when he would watching this film, realizing that he is not alone. There's literally probably, I don't know if I'd say millions, but possibly millions of people that are basically told there isn't any truth here and it didn't happen. But what you're not told is the rest of the story. And so sadly, there are a lot of people who have been damaged, in their faith because they were given bad information. And that's the reason why I think a film like this, let's go back and start to understand what's really happening here, and let's look for the evidence of that. And it's hard, Shelley, that there are parts of history that in the mainstream world of history and archaeology, there's hardly any evidence for it, but no one questions that. They just say that's the way it was. When you come to biblical evidence, boy, it's the standard is way up here, and for other evidence, it's way down here. But I think there's a spiritual component to this, and so there is a reason why people don't want to believe, because they'd have to be held accountable. So these films are meant to pause and to help people to take take a moment and look. And that's why it might be very valuable to bring. You can, if you go to patternsofevidence.com and type the ticket link, you can actually invite groups to come see the film. And it's important that you go see the film in a theater. and not say, I'll wait for it. And why is that? It's because the culture would be more than happy to privatize all this and to have you not have a story about God in the Bible in a shopping mall. They're going to have other movies there, but boy, don't put something about the Bible there. Well, the point is that we want to do well, and we want to basically have a public forum. And if you've got somebody at your office or somebody you've been talking to, invite them to this film, because it's an archaeological film. It's an investigative film. It's an opportunity to open the door to talk about spiritual things, and it'll work. We have thousands of testimonies of people that get into this, and they're just, because it's not just the film. I think I think that God will use this film to open the door in people's hearts, and that's the reason why going to a theater, inviting people, isn't important, because it's a public place, and it's a great place for people to see a film in a non-threatening way.
The thing that the prophets are just constantly advocating for is return to God, and He will return to you. Amos says, seek me and live. Hosea says, the world is lost because they've lost a knowledge of God. And so even if it's just to go to the film and pursue God with your head and hope that the heart can be changed in the process. I mean, God was kind to send the prophets to call people back to Him. Also, I think, too, the timing of the film, as a pro-Israel Christian who's just really worried about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world right now, I think this film is really brave, and it's telling the truth about Israel, and it's a defense of Israel. I mean, it's in the title. And so it's just one more positive thing that we can put out there after October 7th that will also speak love to our Jewish brothers and neighbors as well. Thank you so much for being on the show, Tim. And really, people don't have long. This film is coming out soon. So this is new news, and requires an immediate follow-up. Is there a place that people can just sign up for your newsletters as well?
Yeah, at patternsofevidence.com. They'll see the link for buying tickets, and buy tickets now, because the theaters won't hold the space sometimes. If they don't think people are going to go, they're going to give it to Hollywood, because they're every week they got to try to sell tickets and popcorn. So invite people, invite your pastor, Bible study leader, invite your Sunday school class or your Bible study group. We've got trailers there that you can see. So, well, thank you so much, Shelley, for having me.